Complete training is available at itdvds.com.
In order to install Windows Server Update Services 3.0 with Service Pack 2, your system needs to meet certain system requirements. First, let's take a look at where to find those system requirements. I'm at Google, and I'm just going to type in WSUS, hit enter. I'm going to go to the Windows Server Update Services homepage. I'm going to scroll down just a bit, and the deployment guide is where you'll find both the hardware requirements as well as the software requirements for WSUS 3.0 SP2. So let's take a look at those. First, let's take a look at the minimum hardware requirements, and this is just the minimum requirement. It doesn't necessarily mean that WSUS 3.0 SP2 is going to perform the way you want it. We'll talk about that in a second. First of all, you need a CPU with a minimum of 1 GHz, 1.5 GHz or faster is recommended, a graphics card of at least 16 megabytes hardware accelerated PCI AGP video, RAM at least 1 gig, 2 gig or more is recommended, a page file of at least 1.5 times the physical memory. For the I/O subsystem, you're going to need a fast ATA IDE 100 hard disk or equivalent SCSI drive, network adapter, minimum 10 megabits, 100 megabits or more is recommended. Both the system partition and the partition on which you install WSUS 3.0 SP2 must be formatted with NTFS, so it can't be on a FAT file system. Minimum 1 gig of free space for the system partition, minimum 2 gig of free space on the volume for which the database files will be stored, and we'll talk about this later on. The database actually doesn't get that big for WSUS, but you do need a minimum of 20 gigs of free space on the volume on which the content is stored, so these are going to be the actual updates. 30 gigs is recommended. Notice that WSUS 3.0 SP2 cannot be installed on a compressed drive. So those are going to be the minimum hardware requirements. Now let's talk about what you'll need in order to get your system to perform the way you want it to. And these are going to be some sample configurations that Microsoft has tested out in their labs for 100,000 clients. So this is going to be 100,000 desktops and 100,000 servers that you want to update with Windows Server Update Services. You're going to need 2 front-end servers in a network load balance configuration. And for your back-end server, in this scenario, most likely you would have a clustered SQL server. As far as the hardware goes, for the front-end servers, you're talking about Intel Core 2 CPU, 2.13 gigahertz with 4 gig of RAM. Your back-end server has 8 Opteron processors, 2.2 gigahertz with 32 gigs of RAM. So these are fairly beefy machines, but this is to support 100,000 clients. That's a fairly large company. For a mid-size to smaller company, you would put Windows Server Update Services on a single server, so not in a network load balance configuration. This can handle up to 25,000 clients, so quite a few. And here you're working with an Intel Core 2 quad CPU, so quad core, with 2.4 gigahertz and 4 gig of RAM. So this is a pretty powerful processing server, but not a whole lot of RAM. So you can tell the more clients you have, the more processor intense it's going to be, but not necessarily intense on RAM. And it is important to have a server that can handle the load for your Windows Server Update Services. You don't want that server locking up or slowing down and causing updates to fail on your clients, which could cause other problems in your environment. So that was the hardware requirements. Now let's talk about the software requirements. For an operating system that you're going to put WSUS 3.0 with Service Pack 2, you're going to need at least Windows 2003 with Service Pack 2. If you're using just regular Windows Server 2008, it's going to have Service Pack 1 on it, and Windows Server 2008 R2 works as well. And that's what we're going to be using, is Windows Server 2008 R2. It lets you know that WSUS 3.0 SP2 is also supported for use in virtual operating system environments, so it's not required that it be on a physical machine. It can be on a virtual machine. You're going to need IIS 6.0 or later, and this kind of goes without saying because you have to have Windows 2003 or later, so you're going to have IIS 6.0 or later. You need .NET Framework 2.0 or later. For a database backend for your Windows Server Update Services, you can use SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2005 with Service Pack 2. You don't have to. Microsoft doesn't necessarily recommend it, that you use SQL Server, full-blown SQL Server. Windows Server Update Services actually comes with an internal database that works quite well. You're going to need the Microsoft Management Console 3.0, the Microsoft Report Viewer Redistributable 2008. This is going to be for your management console for WSUS. And also it lets you know that you cannot run terminal services on the computer that is the front-end server for a remote SQL installation.